Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. This evening's show is part of our Legislative Issues series hosted by Jim Parisi. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Today we're going to talk about important legislation related to contract negotiations for both teachers and other school support staff called the Responsible Contracting Act. And with us we have two knowledgeable guests who are going to fill us in. Representative Anastasia Williams, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Representative, you have been in the State House for 2 decades now, having first been elected in 1992. That's considerable longevity.
Yes, it seems like just yesterday that I got there, though.
And Representative, you represent the 9th District in Providence, and you are chair of both the House Labor Committee as well as the Black and Latino Caucus.
Yes, and I'm also co-chair of the Providence delegation along with Representative John Carnevale.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you for joining us. And one final comment. Tell us about your employment. I know I'm getting a little off script. You work for First Source
Yes,
Providence.
I'm the First Source coordinator for the City of Providence. And what First Source is a program that employs individuals that reside in the City of Providence with companies or nonprofits who have benefited through a tax stabilization and or some type of financial assistance. So if they have a position or plan on having a position due to the resources that they have received from the city, it's their due diligence to employ city employees, city residents as their employees. They look to do a list and see if there's any qualified individuals, and they bring them on board as their employees.
Okay, well, thank you for that information. And also joining us is Patrick Crowley of the NEA Rhode Island. Pat, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jim.
Pat, you're my colleague, my partner in crime, if you will, as a teacher union representative in the State House, but you also do labor relations work as well, don't you?
I do. I represent several locals across the state, primarily professional workers at the Department of Health and the professional staff at URI and at CCRI.
Okay. And how long have you worked for the labor movement, Pat?
Going on 15 years. I've been with NEA now for 7, but I've worked for the Service Employees Union and for the Teamsters Union before that.
About half of my labor union guests have a background with SEIU, myself included. They were my first job right out of college. Representative, before we talk about the Responsible Contract Resolution Act, let's get a little bit of background. Why did you first run for office in 1992 for the General Assembly?
Well, I'm a grassroots organizer by just liking to help people. And at the time, my elected official was Mr. Caprio, Frank Caprio Jr. And, you know, while we had senators and council people in our district, he was the only one that responded back in the late 80s, early 90s. Every time the community would call upon his service, he would always respond and be there. And he was vacating his position. So what he did, he said that he extended me the opportunity of looking into wanting to run for office. And I'm, I'm a mother and housewife. No, that's not something I'm interested in.
And this was your first run for office. You hadn't been elected to city council or anything like that before you took a run for the assembly, had you?
No, just plain old community person giving a helping hand. Some of us are born to serve, some of us are born to be rich, and some of us are born to be beautiful, and some of us are just born. So I believe that I was born to serve, to be a public servant.
And other than this legislative issue, what other issues are you working on in the General Assembly this year?
Well, there are several things that I'm working on. One being the Ban the Box, which is an extremely important piece of legislation with regards to giving an opportunity to someone who has, fallen short in society, made a mistake when they were younger, and have a mark against them. So when you fill out an application, there's generally a question, have you ever been convicted of a felon? So by virtue of checking that box off, many employers, what they do, if once they see that check, they disregard that individual. And that individual could be very well qualified, available, and by making a mistake in their life, should not be kept away from employment. So that's one of the pieces of legislation that I am looking to work on diligently this year. Another piece of legislation that I see that is extremely important is that due to the census, there are individuals that are incarcerated that are in the ACI in Cranston, and their numbers are counted for the city of Cranston. But many of those individuals, within a day, 2, a week, or a month, are coming back into their neighborhoods. They're back to their homes. So we're trying to identify a policy or a change, and many other states are looking into doing the same, where those individuals be counted at their actual last residence or city. Because it's totally unfair to have however many incarcerated individuals in a particular city, and those numbers are there, and they come back into the actual city for which they reside, and that particular city is not getting the funds or the recognition with the numbers, the actual numbers that they should be getting. So that's another important piece of legislation that I'm also working on.
Okay. Also on the point of background, Patrick, so who does the NEA represent here in Rhode Island?
We have about 12,000 members across the state. Educators, obviously classroom teachers. We have education support professionals, everyone from the teachers, assistants in the classroom, people that work across the schools, whether it's bus drivers, people that work in kitchens, people that work cleaning the schools. We also represent people at all of the higher ed institutions other than Rhode Island College. But we have people at some of the private colleges, including Rhode Island School of Design, Roger Williams University. We have people in professional jobs across the state. We really are a professional union here in Rhode Island. We have a very active retiree local union. And when it comes to people that work in Rhode Island, we like to say that 1 out of every 100 people in Rhode Island is a member of NEA Rhode Island. And when we join forces with our colleagues and our union brothers and sisters in the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, your union, we really are a real fabric of this state. And it's one of the more heartening parts about this small state of Rhode Island, that being an educator in Rhode Island is such a real important part of this state. Everywhere you go, you meet a teacher, an educator, someone who's part of this union and our unions collectively. It's really, heartwarming to be able to be part of such an important community.
So with that kind of diverse membership, you must also have a diverse legislative agenda. Other than this issue that we're going to talk about related to teachers and school support staff, what are the other legislative initiatives that are your priorities this year?
We have several very important things that we're looking at. First and foremost, we're looking at something that will address the concerns our members have about privatization. There's been a very successful piece of legislation that was passed several years ago at the state level that acts as a sunshine rule when it comes to privatization at state worker level. And we're hoping that something will be enacted at municipal level when it comes to municipal privatization. Not so much that it would stop it, but that it will act as a fair and transparent process if there's going to be privatization at the municipal level. We're hoping that there'll be something enacted at the General Assembly that will increase the voices of educators for the new Board of Education. We're hoping a teacher advisory council will be put in place so that when the Board of Education is looking at policies that impact the day-to-day lives of teachers and educators, that the voices of teachers will be heard in that process. Senator Gallo and Representative McNamara have introduced bills in the House and in the Senate that would create this kind of teacher advisory council. And we're hoping that that will get, some real, important feedback and hopefully enacted into law. But beyond that, it's really the Responsible Contract Resolution Act that Chairwoman Williams has introduced that is one of the key pieces of legislation that we're hoping to have a real strong showing and enact into law this year.
And why don't you take it from there, Pat? Why don't you start by explaining to our viewers what the Responsible Contract Resolution Act is?
Sure. Primarily we see this bill as a real important step at ending a great deal of uncertainty in the way the current law applies to contract negotiations between educators, classroom teachers, education support personnel, and school committees. There is a flaw in the current law that when school committees and educators come to an impasse in contract negotiations, the law doesn't necessarily give good directions about what the parties are supposed to do. There is a process in place in the law that talks about when the parties reach an impasse, the parties can go to mediation. And then when mediation doesn't produce an agreement, they're allowed to go to arbitration, and an arbitrator is selected. But what happens is when an arbitrator issues an award, that award is not binding on financial matters. What this law does is make the award binding on all matters. Currently, the award is binding on everything except financial matters. And what this law is really end the uncertainty in that process. So for example, it would make it binding on things like wages and health insurance, where it currently is binding on things like education policies, school days, etc. And what it would do is, just on some technical matters, it would allow for a retired judge or a member of the Rhode Island judiciary system to be the arbitrator. And I think what we've done is, working with Chairwoman Williams, is craft a piece of legislation that has tried to address a lot of the concerns we've heard over the last few years. We've put into the bill addressing some of the concerns about making sure that students, teachers, and taxpayers are the first criteria that the arbitrator has to take into account when the arbitrator is crafting their award. The criteria about whether or not a city or town can actually pay the award is written right into the piece of legislation. Another important piece of this is the parties can continue to negotiate and try to settle the dispute right up until the time the award is issued. Another thing that's in the bill is that there's a definite timeline for this process. So the process doesn't go on indefinitely. Right now, as the bill is written, it takes 107 days from the time the arbitration process starts until it's finished. Another important feature, teacher strikes would be illegal. It's written right into the bill. Right now, there's a little bit of gray area in terms of how that process is interpreted, at least. We wanted to make sure that as this bill gets introduced, written, and hopefully passed this year, we want to make it clear. This is the preferred dispute resolution mechanism. And that's really what we're talking about. Right now, if there's uncertainty in the process, we want to make sure, let's end the uncertainty. Let's have this be the preferred method of dispute resolution.
Representative and chairperson, so you sit in an important position. You've heard the debates on this bill in past years. Why did you make the decision to be the prime sponsor on this bill this year?
Well, as you mentioned, I've heard it over and over for several years. And the arguments, while they're interesting on both sides, I just felt that we needed to move forward. We needed to, once and for all, get to the table, deal with the issue, and try to come on a solution. And when I read the bill, I said, I remember former Representative Savage, and he's a gentle soul, that man, I surely miss him. You know, his explanation was so clear. And because of that, that's why I said, you know what, I'm gonna see if it's available and look to sponsoring it. I want both parties to come to the table and agree on the solution to what's before us. 3 individuals came to testify. I was dismayed and disappointed by them. One individual came and asked another gentleman, I'm going to just keep their names out of our conversation, but hopefully when they see this, they'll know that it's them I'm speaking about. Sent an individual to ask me if they could testify first because they had someplace else to go. If you have concerns and if you really cared and was committed, you would have made sure that the appropriate time to be there was blocked out. That was one. 2 other individuals, part of their testimony to me, and I took it as they were throwing the ball now in my lap, was, if you would like to sit with us, or we will sit with you and work with you on some solutions to this matter. My opinion and feeling was, if you was, again, sincere and committed, you would have came with those solutions at the hearing and made it part of your testimony, and then extend the opportunity of, can you, will you, are you interested in sitting with us and looking over these solutions that we have presented? So I was totally dismayed by those 3 individuals doing what they did. So I'm throwing back the ball to them and telling them it's time to come to the table, because this bill is certainly one that needs to pass, because it's up to them to quell the fear that they have been presenting, that it'll go to the arbitrator, the cities and towns are going to end up paying the bill, you know, the taxpayers are going to be responsible. Well, we don't have to get to that point. We have more than enough time before getting to that final decision. So we come to the table and we agree to disagree, but we leave that room with agreeing that that bill, with a little bit of changes here and there, will be a bill that will move things forward from now on.
I think you really hit the nail on the head with your challenge, because there's been lots of opposition over the years, but when asked, the opponents don't offer any alternative to this kind of legislation, binding arbitration on all matters as a means of resolving contract disputes. It's not like the people who represent school committees are coming saying, well, just give them a right to strike and that'll be it. There's no other solution that's really viable out there other than the bill that you've put your name to.
And that's why I say I was totally dismayed and disappointed in these individuals, because if you really are committed, I mean, you came here to almost say, you know, I'm only here because it's part of the process, you know, nothing's going to happen, and then it's going to throw the responsibility in my lap, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Come on, if you are ready, let's do this. But if that's only if you're really sincere, and they showed me their sincerity, and they're not ready. So, you know, some of us have to learn the hard way.
Actually, Jim, I think what the chairwoman has really done with this bill is highlight what I think our 2 unions have tried to get across with our testimony and what we're trying to accomplish with this bill. As I see it, binding arbitration, you know, responsible contract resolution is an optional last resort. You know, and I know, as people that sit at the bargaining table on a frequent basis, that's where this process of, you know, negotiation should take place. You know, as someone who sat at the bargaining table with local school committees, that's where deals get hashed out. You want to be able to have local school committees and teachers in the classroom sit down and talk with their superintendent, their local school committee, and work out the deals that are going to matter to their local committees. Because that's what's going to be important. They understand what's important to the people that work in their communities. And it's going to be different in Burrillville, North Smithfield, Cranston, and Providence. And I think there is a misconception that unions are going to be running to arbitration to have an arbitrator get a deal for them that they couldn't get at the bargaining table. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think if you read the bill that's been introduced, it is not something that I know my union is going to be looking forward to this process. In fact, the opposite could be true. We're looking at this bill as an option of last resort simply because we actually encourage the process of collective bargaining. And that's what our unions are built on, the process of collective bargaining. We'd rather have our negotiators, our teachers, talk with their superintendents. We don't see arbitration as, a solution. We see it as when things have broken down. However, we see the problem in the current law, and we see a problem that needs to be fixed. And we see this as the better solution than the status quo. And if the status quo is allowed to continue on, it's that uncertainty that is a problem that needs to be addressed.
As a practitioner, I certainly echo, I don't want to arbitrate. I want to negotiate with the employer. And most contracts are solved and reached at the bargaining table, even in Connecticut, which is a state that does have binding arbitration for teachers and other employees. And Patrick, you've seen some of that information about Connecticut. Are the arbitration awards in Connecticut very different than the negotiated settlements for teachers?
They're actually more in favor of management more often than not. They have a very different law than what we're proposing. I mean, it's framed in a very similar way, but not so. I mean, it's Connecticut. They have a different legal framework than Rhode Island. But what their General Assembly has found is more often than not, the awards go in favor of management or school committees than they go in favor of the union. And I think that's just testimony to what we're talking about here. It is not something that the union is going to be running into as a way to either increase wages or increase benefits, especially in a down economy where an arbitrator is simply going to hand the keys to the finances or the keys to the checkbook over to the union so they can write a blank check. I mean, we practice in the real world, Jim. You know this as much as anyone. It is not like you're dealing in the private sector where finances are a secret. We know what the economy is like, and we know what town budgets are like. If there's no money, we know what the reality is. So if we have to, we'd rather negotiate with a town council or a school committee over what the finances are, because an arbitrator, more often than not, is probably going to rule in favor of a school committee or a town council in the circumstances that we face in Rhode Island today.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that our viewers may not be aware of. We have binding arbitration for police and fire here in the state, but the bill that you've crafted, Chairwoman, includes elements that arbitrators have to consider, including the community's ability to pay or the interest of the taxpayers. That's different than the existing statute for police and fire.
Yes, it is, but unfortunately, like I said, it appears as though those individuals that came to testify against it came with the same mindset of the previous years, opposed to really looking at the bill, dissecting the bill, and coming and saying, okay, let's sit and talk about it. And Pat said it clear. There's absolutely nothing wrong with both parties coming and sitting at the table. But it was clear to me at this hearing that they didn't even want to look at each other, far less sit down and discuss the matter at hand. Now, that is what I'm looking for. I want for them to come back to the table and let's talk about this, because this bill has a lot of language that is positive and constructive, and they did not give it a thought. They didn't give it the right thought at all. So they really need to take it and look at it. They went right to taxpayers, the cities and towns can't afford it. It was like, wait a minute, did you read it? Did you read it? Did you really read it? Or you just didn't want to hear it? You know, so I would love for them to come to the table and do their due diligence with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a veteran of the General Assembly, you know when you testify on a bill, it's not about the idea behind it. It's about the words on the page.
Absolutely.
And details really do matter, don't
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that's why, you know, I have tried to encourage anyone who's coming before my committee, come prepared. Don't come, you know, and just like they did and expect me to do the work, because I'm going to be tough. It's going to be like, oh, look, all and nothing. So you read it, you had your assignment, you had your homework, you need to have done your due diligence, but you came and you didn't give it the proper time because you felt, oh, this is the same as last year and the previous years, and I'm going to just dismiss it. And that's what they did. And I think it was unfair. So they have one more bite at the apple to come back. And I don't know if it'll be a shiny apple, but it'll be nice for them to be wanting to come back and talk to me about it.
Patrick, the chairwoman's pretty clear on her thoughts on what some of the opposition is. How would you characterize the opposition to this bill? You sat in on the hearing this past month. You've sat on hearings in prior years. What do you make of the opposition, and how do you respond to the points they make?
I think there's two sets of opposition. I think, you know, you have the people that are opposed to it just to be opposed to it. And I think there's that group of people that you're never going to move. And I think that's fine. I understand that. And then I think you heard for the first time a set of people that were trying to indicate that maybe there is some movement this time. Maybe there is a realization that after 20 years of pushing on this issue, maybe finally there is some acknowledgement that some of the points that Chairwoman Williams is addressing here need to be finally put into this bill. I'll give an example. There's some points that have been made in this hearing this time that if they were addressed, maybe we could make some issues. The bill that's been introduced has one method of addressing the arbitration award. It's called issue by issue. If, for example, the arbitrator had to offer the award as what's called last best offer total package, which is an even more high stakes method of arbitration. That was a version that was passed by the Senate in 2011, something that our unions have addressed in the past, Jim. It's something that we would at NEA, and I think, I'm not speaking for you, but I think we've talked about in the past, we would be amenable to that type of, issue being addressed in a different version of this bill. That's something I heard in the hearing, and I think that's something that we could move forward on. So I think if you looked at the opposition and kind of there's two types of people. The people that are opposed to it just to be opposed to it. And then I think you heard the people that are looking at this from a practical, pragmatic point of view. They couldn't quite bring themselves to say it at the hearing, but I think they're giving an indication that if there's some way to meet in the middle, and I think we're more than willing to meet in the middle, work with the chairperson, work with the communities of educators in the management side of the aisle. I know that we're more than happy to work with all people of good faith to meet in the middle on this very important issue.
And it's about the children, the teachers, and the cities and town, the administrators. So keeping that in mind, because a teacher being under a lot of pressure, it's going to spill over onto the students. And it is, the students feel it. So those three components, making it the priority, we need to be at the table. I'm looking forward to this because this is definitely one that I'm close to and one that I want to see make a step, 2 or 3 forward. It's time.
Well, that's certainly promising. As a program note, the Senate has passed some form of this in the past. Senator Mike McCaffrey has reintroduced the same bill again in the Senate this year, and we look forward to working with your challenge of coming together, because we know your challenge isn't just for the opponents, but it's for us too.
Oh, absolutely.
To work things out.
Absolutely.
And make something happen this year.
Yes. I'm open to negotiate, to sit down and hear both sides for the betterment of all parties, especially the kids that are affected by all this.
Okay, well, unfortunately our time is up, but I thank you both very much for this interesting discussion about a very important issue. And we thank you for joining us for this edition of the Labor Vision.
Good evening and welcome again to our seemingly endless look at American labor history. My name is Scott Molloy from the University of Rhode Island, and by the way, tonight I have on the Graduate Students Union t-shirt from your state university, and it's about 600 people in the union who work for URI as assistants at the graduate level, and must represent about folks from 40 different countries. It's an amazing thing to see, and really what the labor movement should be all about anyway. Last time we took another look at the 1930s and the emergence of the CIO, as well as the beginnings of World War II, which in many ways ended the Great Depression. It's a terrible thing to have to admit that it takes a conflict of that magnitude to put people back to work, but that's what it was, and people stayed at work long after the war as well. So we're going to look at this in a little more detail, not so much the military side of it, but there are some interesting statistics that I think you'll find interesting. Roosevelt, like most other presidents, whether it was World War I or the Civil War or whenever, understood that labor peace was integral to winning the war, that they could not have interruptions, walkouts, or strikes during a conflict. And by the way, there were only a handful in World War II, usually in the coal industry when the owners tried to take advantage of the situation. So there were some wildcats, but they were 0.1%. And basically, American workers went to work. They also made an informal pledge through the AFL and the CIO, who were still kind of at loggerheads, but working together in the war, that they wouldn't strike as long as the conflict lasted, and by and large that was adhered to. Why would labor give up that? Well, of course, if patriotism would be one thing. But secondly, they got in return a couple of things that they didn't have before. And that was anyone who went to work in a place that was already represented by a union, and of course everyone was working those days, and most people working in industry receiving federal funds for government contracts labored at a place that had a union. So new people who were hired on had 30 or 15 days, whatever it might have been at the time, to join the union or not to work there. And so the ranks of both the AFL and the CIO grew precipitously during World War II. Also, management made a pledge, and this is always a very controversial subject, that they would take the weekly dues out of each employee's paycheck and send it over to the union, rather having the shop steward in the local have to collect it by hand, which I imagine was never an easy task under any circumstances. The problem was, looking at this psychologically many years later, is that interaction between the shop steward and some of the employees who willingly paid up their dues and some who didn't, kind of ended a rapport that both groups had, the rank and file and the shop steward, who was kind of the first line of defense for the local union. So it was a great thing that they now received the dues and a paycheck and didn't have to chase people. But at the same time, it meant that intimacy between the union and the people it represented was somewhat strained because of this new practice. I might also add, so people don't think, oh, gee, labor got everything here, wages were capped during the war. That is, with almost no exceptions. Factory X couldn't say to a worker at Factory Y, come over to our place and do the same job and get another 25 cents an hour. It was disallowed by the law, it was illegal, and it was not practiced. So wages stayed basically at the same level in 1941, or 42 really, until the end of the war itself. But of course, having a union contract meant that you probably got a better paycheck anyway. But on the other side of the chasm, profits were not capped. Corporations, businesses, combinations, whoever produced anything in America had no level, no top on how much money they could make. Just like the government did not want any labor interruptions, they didn't want any factories or businesses holding back, trying to make an extra buck or two. They'd rather pay it up front and make sure that industry was going 24/7. And believe me, it did. And we'll see the consequences of that in just a minute. One United Automobile Workers official was quoted as saying during the war, "I want to make damn certain that a just share of victory means that a union will be here when the boys do come home." And you maybe should have said the gals as well, because here we have the sheet music from Rosie the Riveter. The number of women that took the places of men who had to go off to war was amazing. Many women who had never worked in factories previously now found employment and were able to do some of these jobs that were seen as very, very skilled once they had an opportunity to practice. And during World War II, of course, there was an election in 1944. The labor movement, particularly the CIO and working people in general, got behind Franklin Roosevelt for what would be his fourth and final term. He would die while World War II was still on, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But here they are at Soldiers Field in Chicago with a CIO rally for FDR and the New Deal. One of the things I try to tell my students about, not simply the facts and figures, which are always interesting about any of these things, but you want life experiences to come out of whatever you're teaching. You want them to be able to apply whatever lessons need to be learned from a particular decade, generation, or whatever might happen around you. And one of the most unusual elements of World War II, and I don't think many people appreciate this, because oftentimes when I recite these figures, people look at me with opened eyes as to, what are you talking about? In the first 2 years of World War II, 7,000 domestic workers were killed more than soldiers. 7,000 more people died in industrial accidents at home than perished on the field of battle in the foxholes of Europe or on the Pacific Ocean in naval engagements. Hard to believe, but it's true. And by the end of the war, and in fact the casualty figures really didn't rise tremendously until D-Day, when the troops from the Allied forces took back Europe, slowly but surely, but had to land on the beaches of Normandy under withering fire from the German occupying forces, but eventually were able to take it. And then, of course, the sojourn into the Sea of Japan. My dad was on a U.S. aircraft carrier and participated in some of the bloodiest battles that the world had ever seen in the 1943, 44, and 45. When the war was over, and I always tell people we win World War II faster than any other thing that I ever go through. It only takes about 10 minutes, but not to take anything away from the tremendous effort and sacrifice of both the soldiers on the front and the soldiers at home. And when everything was said and done, it's estimated that approximately 300,000 American GIs died on the field of battle. 300,000 American soldiers, airmen, naval cadets gave the final sacrifice in order to protect ourselves from the Nazis and the totalitarians in Japan. 300,000, another 700,000 injured, wounded in the war, for 1 million casualties. 300,000 dead, 700,000 hurt in one way or another, some crippled for life. Other countries paid similar prices. Some of them paid much greater prices. But one statistic that's often forgotten, and I love to tell this to my students because it really is a key into understanding the great wealth, the changing nature of our society after World War II. And that was almost 100,000 American workers died in World War II at home on the domestic front. 300,000 abroad, 100,000 at home. Innumerably 10,000 more in various injuries suffered in industry. Now, it could be a mine cave-in, it could be an explosion at a munitions factory, or it could be just a single individual working at an outdated machine that had no safety features who lost their life. But when you tally it up, the two groups, the soldiers on the battlefront and the soldiers on the domestic front, formed a 1-2 combination that really won that war. They needed each other, and both came through with flying colors. There's an amazing statistic that comes out of all of this, and that is, despite, and I always like to call it conflagration, it's a big word, but when you look at World War II and how many people died globally, it's just mind-boggling. I mean, they don't even have an actual number. I guess it's kind of pick whatever you want. What we often forget is that during the war, despite the loss of so many people at home and abroad, that the life expectancy of the average American increased during World War II. Now, how can you lose so many people in a situation like that over a course of 4 years and still have people living longer? Usually when people are dying because of extraordinary circumstances, it drags down the life expectancy of a nation or a group or a demographic or whatever. But people in America were living longer during the war. How did they do that? Well, the demographers, the academics, different scholars looked at this for years. They finally came up with an answer. And a fascinating one, I think you'll find it. And that is, because of the nature of the war, when people went into the factory, even though management could not pay you more to come work for them because it was against the law, wages were frozen, they opened the Pandora's box and provided labor with something they'd been demanding for 50, 60, 70 years, almost unprecedented. They offered workers from other factories and companies health care benefits. They were rudimentary. They were primitive. You wouldn't even brag about them today because they don't seem like much. Maybe at first it was simply providing a physician for a couple of weeks every year on the factory floor to examine people to see how you were doing. And just like those soldiers and sailors and people in the Air Force who, sometimes coming from places where they never saw a doctor in their lives, finally got a physical and caught some problem that might have killed them later on, the same thing was true in the factories of America. that the doctors found little problems that were later going to kill these people. And the companies came through by perhaps providing half the cost of a medical prescription. So you could go down and get penicillin or whatever it was that you needed, and the doctor signed it for you. And later on, it might have been a paid holiday. Little by little, things became a little bit better. And once American working people got used to having some type of medical coverage, regardless of how minimal it might have been, they were not going to let it go after the war. And so management, in many ways, and they're the ones who came up with this idea, provided, I think, one of the great things in the 20th century in American society, and that was medical coverage for a lot of people who never had it before. And that certainly made a tremendous difference during the war, and we'll see after the war as well. So medical coverage, people having a greater life expectancy during the war, all because they finally had some type of primitive prescriptions or medicine to take care of them. And not only did labor recognize the fact that post-World War II America was going to be very different, because no one was going to give up this stuff once they had gotten a hold of it, that once the war was over, the CIO would say the kind of labor movement we want is not committed to a nickel in the pay envelope philosophy. We are building a labor movement not to patch up the old world so men can starve less often and less frequently, but a labor movement that will remake the world so that working people will get the benefit of their labor. Boy, that's a remarkable turnaround in the 4 years of World War II. Working people and the unions that represented them. And by the way, by 1960, even as late as 1970, organized labor would represent 35% of all workers in American society. That's a tremendous number. Of course, most of those jobs are no longer with us, and that's one of the problems that the labor movement faces today, and something we'll talk about when we finish this up. But in 1944, just before his death, Franklin Roosevelt, who sadly was not here to see America be victorious, because he certainly had been the greatest cheerleader for America to join the Allies and to take down the fascist threat to the entire world. But he had come up with something that's known as the Economic Bill of Rights, playing off the early Revolutionary War Bill of Rights, which were tacked on to the United States Constitution right after the end of the Revolutionary War. And listen to the things that Franklin Roosevelt called for, because these were union things by and large, but something that both labor and the New Deal wanted for all American people. The right to a job. It sounds so simple today, but all of us know a lot of people that don't have jobs. And so that was a real important thing in that Economic Bill of Rights. He also talked about decent wages. And this, of course, is where the living minimum wage would be instituted during the New Deal. A living wage that you could actually live on. The minimum wage today, you'd have to work 24/7 in order to get by in some way. He called for free business competition at home without monopolizing a particular production process. He said every American should have the right to a decent home. And we know in this great recession that we're going through today that it was Wall Street, not Main Street, that it was the corporate boardrooms, not the union boardrooms, that sold our mortgages to third world countries where they were purchased basically in yard sales somewhere 10,000 miles away. People forget that because it's a lot easier to blame the people down the street and across from where you live. The labor movement had nothing to do with any of that. It was the business community, particularly on Wall Street, that brought that to us. Franklin Roosevelt tried to address that while he was still alive in 1944. A decent home. He called for medical care and health coverage. Of course, we think of so many of those programs that were instituted at that time and built on over the years. So Medicare and things of that nature would take care of us when we do get old. Also, he talked about protection from infirmity and injury and old age. Well, there's Social Security. And even though there's a lot of people in this country right now, not the labor movement, but people who'd like to get rid of Social Security, would like to privatize it, give it to Wall Street to invest. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go there, not as I get near retirement. You don't know what will happen to your money. But the New Deal passed Social Security, and it changed America forever. It took old people out of poverty and gave them a decent life near the end of their life. And the last thing that FDR talked about in his Economic Bill of Rights in 1945 was that every American should have the right to a good education, something we're still debating as we go along today. But what they did with the GI Bill, not only make mortgages available for homes, but also to help you pay for returning GIs to go to college. And I always get a good laugh out of my students down at your state university when I say, when those GIs came back and they went down to URI within a year or two, finally, there were more students there than cows, because URI was an agricultural college. And with the returning GIs and later with their kids, it made a whole world of difference. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, would die in 1944. His place would be taken by Harry Truman, who then actually won re-election in 1948 in a very hotly contested election in which labor had a lot to do with. But he brought us back through World War II with some very controversial measures. But all the things that labor gained during the war, they would try to enshrine and institute in their collective bargaining agreements. And no sooner was the war over, 1945, than the largest strike wave in American history would continue on that year, go through all of 1946 and into 1947. Millions of Americans trying to make up for the loss due to the lack of a cost of living. They had made their sacrifices, the corporations had made fortunes, and they wanted their share, their piece of the pie. And that was one of the greatest labor turnouts. In fact, it was, even to this day, as a percentage. And it's interesting that returning GIs got jobs, joined unions. They no longer had to fight German generals and Japanese generals. Now they were fighting General Motors, General Food, General Signal, General this, and General that. It was a whole new ballgame. And people were not about to let go for 1 minute those hard-earned gains that they had finally accomplished in the 1940s and World War II. And so, those of us who came after them, I was born in 1946, original baby boomer. I was brought up in a world of plenty, unlike my parents or my grandparents who suffered through the Great Depression and World War II. And we were given things that our ancestors could have only dreamed about over the decades and generations, even the centuries. But there was one problem. with all of this. And that is, we took it for granted. We thought all this cornucopia, this horn of plenty of benefits and working conditions was supposed to be there. This was the 11th commandment in America, the new 11th commandment, thou shalt have. And I try to tell my students, and I don't blame them. I said, this is not your fault. You have been given from the sweat and sacrifice of the people who went before you a better world. But the problem was that our parents and grandparents never took the time, for whatever reason, maybe it was too painful. They never took the time to sit us down properly and tell us about the Great Depression and World War II and what that was like and how hard they sacrificed to get what we now got unknowingly. And so we look back at their lives, and every blessed penny and nickel and dime that they earned, that they achieved, meant something to them because it was through their effort and sweat and toil. And I say to my students, and again, it's not their fault, it's more my fault and my generation for not letting them know that whatever they get, if they don't earn it, if a new car is just given to them, if their tuition is paid, and they don't do anything for it, they'll never appreciate it, unlike their parents and grandparents. And that, sadly, is one of the awful tales of World War II.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week: Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.